The EB03 Heroine set has hit the field in the One Piece trading card game out in the East, and especially heading into the first championship weekend in Hiroshima, a lot of people are excited of all of these cards heading into this brand new format. Before we stream the championships later this weekend, it's curious to take a look at the entire meta as a whole and kind of see where things are landing with all these new cards. If you haven't heard our set review or any of our other EB03 videos up to this point, highly recommend you go check those out. But before we get going though, I do have to pay rent this month, so let's hear from more from our sponsor. Listen, if you're itching for a brand new playmat, now is the time to check out Nengarden, the sponsor of this video. Not only do they have brand new pre-orders up on their website for Chaos Crew, Green Fury, and the Absolute Ruler designs, which by the way, are phenomenal. But if you're a fan of Goldie Roger, Nengarden actually put out a new playmat called the Journey's End, showcasing Goldie Roger himself, and you yourself can find his One Piece with the possibility of a 1 in 20 chance to get the special Wanted playmat. And on top of that, if you're like me and you absolutely prefer cloth mats, Nengarden has officially posted on their site cloth mats for Green Fury, Absolute Ruler, Berserk, and Journey's End. Plus, if you want a ton of other great accessories that aren't just playmats, they've got the King of Hearts t-shirt, matching pin, other pins alongside of it through the Whole Cake Island, and even stickers. Make sure with whatever you want in Nengarden, use my code Atrocious for 8% off. The link to their website is in the description below. Thank you so much for Nengarden for sponsoring the video, and let's get back to that video. All right, so as we get into this, let's just talk about our top 3. In my personal opinion, Emu, Ace, and Zoro are all still top dogs of this meta, even though none of them really necessarily gain anything to continue to be top dogs. There's nothing really that comes in and absolutely beats them down, right? Stands in their way from being what I consider to be the top 3 decks of the format. That may not surprise a lot of you, so let's start talking about the decks that you are excited about. Starting off with Sugar, but I think Sugar is really just a rogue deck. Not to say that it's bad, we're only going to put leaders on this tier list that I think are worth playing in a tournament, or at least a major tournament, I'll say. And Sugar gaining that flexibility with the Monet and potentially also the Sugar are good cards to be inserted in this deck to help along with consistency, right? More draw, more options. It's a deck that can really get going, right? Especially as you get on that quick heavy ramp, and you're going to have to swing into it eventually. It is definitely a tricky deck to play against. Lim, I'm going to go ahead and throw in this C tier. Lim is also a pretty good deck in my opinion, especially getting that new Odyssey Lim. The game plan is still very much the same to what it was before. Your matchups as well, for the most part, don't really change to what it was prior. You're still a very good, very fun, functioning deck. Now, Trafalgar Law did gain some flexibility, right, with that new Seeker Rare 8-cost Trafalgar Law, but I'm not sure it really solved the problems that it already had, especially in this format and some of its matchups. It's definitely nice to get that extra aggressive swing in, but it's still holding the same area that it once did. Talking about Luffy, I know a lot of people are excited about this Luffy heading into the OP12 format. This is still a pretty good deck, right? We've talked about some of the different options on this channel in videos, especially with the Straw Hat package in red and green being so strong, right? You can get so aggressive, but also hold back a little bit and be super defensive as well. It's a very interesting deck, especially with your leader effect being able to basically be a 2k for every Dawn you leave open on your opponent's turn. And similar to a lot of these other decks that I've already talked about, even though you don't necessarily gain anything, you're just in a pretty decent spot. Now, I made a tweet recently about Vegapunk, and I was like, oh my gosh, how does this deck lose? But like I've kind of talked about, Vegapunk is definitely much of a glass cannon style deck. It hits hard really fast, and definitely when it hits the nuts, it's obviously very, very good. But unlike some of the other decks, your opponent has a chance to survive very well because you're not like playing down rush characters left and right, especially once you know the gimmick of what Vegapunk is, what it does, what it likes to do. You can definitely play around a lot of its options that it has. Bonnie, I think, is a solid, one of the strongest decks in the format. We saw Bonnie recently win the Japan Championship, right, to cap off in OP13, and I don't really think there's too much that's going to adjust that puts Bonnie off of that pedestal. It's a very fair deck in my opinion, but a leader effect that is so strong and so many aggressive outlets to be able to try to push for game, to be able to stall for game, just in my opinion helps green solidify as one of the better colors in the game right now. Smoker, I think, is still just a fine deck. It's so weird. Like, a lot of people, we just hold Smoker super high, in Smoker, especially in the Eastern meta outside of the EB02 format, right? It just doesn't really do anything. There's definitely moments though that when it pops off, it just absolutely snowballs, right? I've seen it a couple times even on this channel. But Smoker, in my opinion, doesn't gain new pieces fast enough to be able to compete with like the top dogs in the meta, I feel like. Speaking of decks that did get a lot of things, I think Nami is a pretty good deck within this format, right? Getting that new Nami, getting the Robin are great additions alongside that Searcher event. What I've kind of started to notice though is a lot of the Nami decks look the same, and even though you can say the same thing about something like Emu, right, where most of the Emu lists are generally the same, when it's in that core form, it doesn't hold the same power level, even though it now has strong options. It wouldn't surprise me, especially in the Hiroshima Championships, to see a Nami appear in the top 16, but I wouldn't expect it to overtake like the number 2 spot in terms of an overall deck population or be the most in a top 16 top cut. This is a great deck, and Blue Yellow Nami fans have never been eaten this good in my opinion, and you're just in a really nice spot in this format. In Doflamingo, I'd also slide this guy down into Rogue. He's definitely a leader that's been holding on for dear life, but a lot of people have been testing that brand new 6-cost boa in EB03 and say that it actually does a lot of damage in game. So especially if it can utilize that on its higher top end to continuously have consistency, right? And Dawns to be able to attach to all these characters to swing 6s, 7s. Doflamingo could be in a really cool spot within this format. I like Doflamingo where he is, but it's definitely on the rogue end. GP Luffy, I'm going to be throwing into the C tier, right? This is still a pretty good deck, don't get me wrong. But the hurt and the fall off that it got nailed with in OP13, nothing's really in here to recover it as much. The 3-cost Robin promo is very strong, right? Having a protection effect that keeps you within this list, but I don't know if it can work. You need a little bit more than that to be able to pack the punch the way that you wanted to, especially with things removing base costs specifically. Speaking of a different Luffy though, I got the purple Luffy in the B tier, right? This is the big counter to Ace, as you may have seen in Cardi Kaizoku's video, right? Being able to Magellan knock people off curve, and that can even be implemented in stuff like the Ace matchup, right? Or really any matchup, you know, the Bonnie matchup to chain 10 drops, things of that nature. Pluffy is also one of those decks that I would consider to be a fair deck where I think it's good and I think it's fun and definitely a viable deck if you want to play it, just not one that's going to be top in every single event in population specifically. For all the Kobe copers, I think you're just going to need to cope a little bit more. I think you got a little bit closer to really being super relevant in a lot of situations, but I think it's just not enough. The new cards in the Hubari and the Kyujaku are definitely really interesting for the deck and do give it a lot of more complex situations for your opponent to be able to deal with. But you still have to have such an uphill battle, I feel like, in this format, especially when your card draw is so limited. Sanji, I think, is a fair deck in the C category. Getting the new Reiju is cool, but deck space is a little tight, I feel like, and you have to really make some decisions. It seems like a lot of people are just moving away from Jozu's right to be able to slide in these different Reijus, which is cool for like the Emu matchup, but there are other situations where Jozu is just so helpful. I really like Sanji though. I think he's still a respectable leader that you want to play in this format. I just think it's such a it's so interesting on a leader. Like, you have to have so much build up to really get going, I think, because even though like Boof Burst like draws cards and stuff, sometimes you can't maintain the hand as fast as you need to. Speaking of maintaining the hand though, this guy's still in a pretty good spot in my opinion within the meta. Who knew that a leader effect of just simply being able to draw 2 cards basically every turn and be able to manipulate the top 5 so you know exactly exactly what you draw when you want to draw it, while also having stuff like Gum Gum Giant would still be good despite the pair bans. I feel like I haven't seen too many people in OP13 play a lot of different Luffy games or try Luffy decks, so I'm really curious to see if deck building all implements the new Charlotte Lin, right? The new 7 cost that we got in EB03. I think it would be kind of cool, especially a 7,000 power body that'll pretty much be able to swing at any leader, potentially have the ability to heal a life, something that you've been missing since the pair ban with Charlotte Lin, the 9 cost. It could be an interesting meta shift that your deck goes into, especially because it can be a 7 Dawn play, right? Still leave plenty of Dawn open. Kalgara, I'll say, is still a good aggressive deck. Being able to cheat out those characters, being able to go super aggressive on your opponent's side of the board. It's just when that board control really goes, it just falls down very, very quick. Marshall D. Teach, still a pretty good deck, I feel like, and I feel like maybe I'm underselling Teach a little bit within this, putting it in the C tier. Teach, once again, just negating on play effects is so good when you're not ready for it. There's a lot of decks that are starting to forget about Teach, right, and his ability to stall out different plays that you can make, which I think can come back to bite you within this format. Teach is one of those decks that once you forget about it, that's when he really hits you. It'll be super curious to see in this format, especially with the introduction of Nami and even, I would say, another deck that I'll talk about here soon, of how they may or may not lose to Teach. It's hard to tell. Bello Betty, I still feel like, is a respectable deck, right? A glass cannon deck, similar to Vegapunk, but you pack an even heavier punch much more quickly before your opponent really gets set up. I still like Bello Betty. I still think Bello Betty is a decent deck, and if you're living just running over a lot of these slow setup decks, keep going, man. Speaking of aggro, I think Yamato moves up a little bit, especially gaining that new Yamato card in EB03. Being able on 5 to not only play that down and give 3 Dawn to your leader, especially if your opponent is at 3 or less life, you can then reutilize the other 2 rested Dawn to play that Yamato somewhere on your field, right? It could be an Izo to make that little Izo a blocker. It could be to another character to swing big as well for like double 8k swings. Having a 5 Dawn play like that for Yamato is actually so good, in my opinion. I'd be so curious and maybe not even surprised to see a Yamato just like absolutely break out in a tournament, similar to what we saw in the Sao Paulo finals, even though that was back in like it was either OP11 or OP12. We streamed it. Reiju, I think, is just another cool rogue aggro deck. Nothing much that's different than before, right? Especially because that new Reiju in EB03 isn't too much of a piece that you want to include in your deck. It's just so hard to beat Porsche Ichiji, Porsche Ichiji, Porsche Ichiji. This is one of the ones that I struggled with, but I'm gonna move Rayleigh down a tier from where I had it at the beginning of the OP13 format. I think Rayleigh is a good deck, and I think Rayleigh has some combo pieces that make it very strong, right? Especially being able to be unblockable for multiple turns. You have so many different counter cards within your deck that don't even need Dawn to be able to be considered counter, and plenty of aggression swarming the board and having access to different rush characters like Kid Killer. But especially in the East, we've seen a huge decline in OP13 for Rayleigh decks, right? Not only in population, but also just appearances within these top cuts of Japan championships. Rayleigh is still a respectable deck and still one that can make some noise. It's just not as much as what it used to be when it first released in OP12. I've still got Jewelry Bonnie as well as a respectable deck, even though it's technically the worst leader of OP13, still a strong and viable one if you want to take it and perform in a tournament. Being able to have those trigger effects, being able to reutilize Dawn constantly in this deck and still have access to things like removal and healing kind of gives this deck a lot of strengths in several situations. It still throughout the time still has good populations, in my opinion, in these high level tournaments. Now Gold D Roger I definitely think is an A deck. The King of the Pirates, even though it feels like a really simple game plan, right, that you're doing pretty much every single turn, a lot of people just can't stop it because you're going in with the ramping and eventually getting getting to a 7,000 power leader, and with the promo, right, because the promo is released out in the Eastern format, be a 9,000 power leader some turns. We've seen it on this channel. Roger's definitely a solid pick, and nothing really in this format really knocks it down too much, and it's still one that I would consider bringing into a major event, especially if I was trying to win. Okay, let's fill up this rogue category a little bit more, first with Boa. A lot of people have actually talked about Boa, and I don't believe a lot of the hype that they say within this, but having access to that new piece in that Boa and maybe some of the other ones can give it a little bit of a surprise edge, right, heading into this format. I need to believe it when I see it. Uta, I almost wanted to leave off of this list in general. I know I showed you guys some lists of Uta and how it could be played, especially with the new counter event card, but it just still falls flat a little bit, I think. I think it's just overpowered in the meta, and I just don't see it really going anywhere. Red Purple Luffy, though, I kind of want to see a Red Purple Luffy like break out and emerge in this format, right? Especially being able to ramp, especially with the new 7-cost Charlotte Linlin, and still be able to play something like the 9-drop Linlin. I'd be really curious to watch this guy go, even though I feel like compared to its other 3 life 6,000 power multicolored leaders, your leader effect just isn't as good as the other one when you're kind of just a vanilla leader at the beginning of the game. Black Purple Luffy, I still think, is holding on for dear life in this format. I don't necessarily really believe it, but potentially having access to something like that new pudding, right, to be able to re-ramp Dawn, especially after you do something like a Zoro or a Robin or something like that, and having access to different things like the OP12 Robin, some aggressive Purple Rush Luffys, you can steal a game or two. Kid, I think, is also holding on to its last breath. Being able to have these extra blockers is nice, but when removal is really prevalent in some of these top decks, do your blockers really even matter? Enel, I still think, is in a fine spot. A lot of people play Enel, and it's a difficult deck to play against for a lot of these different archetypes. Being able to go through 7-8 life, it feels like, in games, while also, once you get to that end game of Enel, going big body, big body, big body, big body. Can you actually deal with the big bodies and the healing on top of it? Zoro Sanji in EB03, I think, is a good B tier deck. It's a strong presence within the format. It's a deck that people have to be thinking about in the format, right? Still has a pretty decent population size in the tournaments. And in EB03, getting that new Kuina, which is so nice within the deck. I hope to be able to see it break the mold a little bit more. I really think in order to justify this opinion, we're going to need to see Zoro Sanji in a top 15 in these next couple weeks before OP14 releases, right? I think there's 4 different Japan championships actually within this EB03 format over these next 4 weeks. There's got to be a Zoro Sanji top cutting one of them. Now Sabo, I actually am going to put in the A tier. I was thinking about putting it in the B tier, right? Especially thinking a little bit of what my OP13 Western tier list would look like. But I think getting that new Koala is actually really, really nice for the deck, right? For the reasons that I mentioned in the video, especially of different deck lists that you'll see in EB03 potentially, and even in the set review, being able to recycle that blocker secret rare Sabo is actually so good of an on KO effect, right? It's very easy to be able to make sure that you have that Sabo in the trash, especially because stage filter is so good. You have different 1-cost searchers like the Captain's Assemble event, the 1-cost Koala that fills up your trash. So with the full 4 copies, you're going to have that almost every single time, especially as Koala becomes an 8-cost and then activates your leader effect, right? Koala can be a 6,000 power body to be able to swing at the 6,000 power leaders like Ace and Luffy, and at least there's only one more Dawn to be able to swing at a Gold D Roger. I'm a little cautious on Sabo because of its underwhelming performance, I feel like, in the OP13 format, based on some of my expectations, and maybe those expectations were a little bit more because I'm a Sabo lover, but I genuinely think he's going to be a pretty solid choice. I think we'll definitely see him out of these next 4 weekends within the top 16. Just probably not as much as like Roger or UP Luffy, right? And the final one conversation point that I've been definitely holding out on you guys a little bit is Vivi. Vivi is such an interesting leader in my opinion. It's basically like a Marco deck that has the ability to save bodies like a OP05 red black Sabo, especially for a deck against Ace. I think Vivi can actually have a pretty decent matchup into Ace. Not only can your leader effect and 10 cost Shanks be able to pop a new gate before you go in with your other swings, but because of your heavy removal in the early stages of the game with stuff like Ben Beckman, maybe some Silver's Rayleigh, if you go ahead and establish the Vivi blocker and your opponent is really just negated to like one swing per turn, right? You've been able to control the board a little bit because Ace is only going to play like 7,000 power bodies, right? And you start getting into the loop where they're playing like 10 drop new gate every single turn. Being able on like their leader swing to just block and pitch a dead card in your hand, oh my gosh, it's actually like so good. Now it gets a little bit more difficult when you come into different decks that have consistent removal with something like Emu, right? Being able with the Marcus Mars to pop and then go ahead and swing. And you can't really stop bottom decking like in the Luffy's Mihawk, Gravity Blade, stuff of the sort. But again, some of these other decks, like I think Vivi can actually put in a decent amount of work, but you're really dependent on dropping that 10 drop Kaido, because if you're not careful, you will lose a lot of cards very fast. So I think Vivi is a pretty good B tier candidate. I think it's a very cool deck. I actually think it's pretty decently viable, especially if you want to play it within this format. And especially with the first weekend of the Japan Championships coming up, it wouldn't expect me if that was Lily's highest percentage in terms of a population within a tournament, because so many people want to try this deck in so many different styles when the perfect style maybe hasn't been figured out yet. And yeah, that's my tier list right there. I think I've got everything that I've wanted. I'm sorry if I left out your favorite leader, because honestly, my favorite leader's left out of here too. And again, it's all just opinion, and I haven't done too much testing of EB03. I have just studied the deck list. I have watched a lot of videos of gameplay, heard a lot of discussions from other people, and this is kind of what I'm thinking right now. Let me know what you think in the comments below, but keep it civil, I'll say, and I'll see you in the next video.